Okay, since most folks are here, we'll sort of start on a pre-class thing. If you go to your Canvas, you should see that you have a folder for the project, which I set up yesterday afternoon, a shared folder. That has, for all intents and purposes, most of the resources that I pulled out in the last week or so. A bunch I just pulled out yesterday that are basically e-text. So it doesn't include stuff that you'd have to actually look for, but it does include everything that's sort of available if you do a quick search. And that's also where you would, when you get your parts of the project finished, that's where I want you to put your report or your findings in there. So that's sort of a shared combination of resources. There's maps in there. And I'll put the, when I got to get the video, short video sort of specially theme things done today if I can. I'll put those all in there too. So everything to do with the project that you want to have access to should be in that folder, which is all sort of parsed out. So that should be, I think that's pretty much that for that. There's a lot of resources in there. Some of them, there's a lot more for some areas than others. Those of you that are doing the geology, geomorphology, I'll get that one done right after class, the little sort of dog and pony on how to do that. There's a ton of stuff there. I've read some of it in the past. I skimmed through some of it in the last week or so, but I haven't looked at it in detail. So, other areas, there's basically nothing. Not surprising, in oral history, there's zip. And that's because this is basically scanning what's available in document form, for example, a UH that's available in the public forum. So that a lot of the topics, a lot of the themes are not going to have much of anything. The medical has absolutely nothing because I don't think anyone's ever, I don't know why not, but as far as I can tell, no one's ever written an article or did their master's thesis or something on, medical practices in East Honolulu or something like that. Although actually I didn't search it in a way. So that's sort of just what's out there. That's just using the Pololo search. In other words, Pololo is your search engine through the UH catalog system. So using Pukele, Waimau, Maomai, I'm not sure what you get with other searches. I just haven't had the time to do them. And to be honest, I'm not going to have the time. So depending on what topic you're picking, you might end up having to do some of those searches and see if anything shows up. And, the nice thing is it'll show up really quickly or it won't. In many areas, it just won't. Last time I was talking about the Mahele. In fact, the last couple of times I've been talking about the Mahele in one form or another. There's a ton of literature on the Mahele. There's the really beautiful book on how the Mahele was done by Moffat and I'm going to say Friedlander. I'll see if I can get the citation for it. So I've got it right here. The most famous of these would probably be Van Dyke. He was a professor at UH in the law school. When I was working at the law library, I used to know him. His specialty was monarchy law and monarchy laws related to US law, et cetera, and especially things doing with land claims. He was like the authority. I think he passed away this last year or something like that. Anyways, so he wrote a couple of books. This was the more recent one. It's probably the one that you want to look at in terms of specifically crown lands, which are a huge area of confusion here. So, there's a ton of stuff on land, loss of land, acquisition of land, who got the land, who lost it. There's a real good book on Kahana that deals largely with this whole issue of loss of land to the Cook or the Castle family. I guess maybe the Castles if it's that part of town. So this is a common theme. And as we'll see, it has a lot to do with modern Hawaiian ethnic identity. This issue of loss of land, loss of relationship to the land. So it's not only a historical situation, it's also a very critical one in terms of how folks that identify themselves as Hawaiian see who they are now and what they were and what happened between then and now. But there's a complex part of that. And to be honest, since the 204 class, the landscape class is going through exactly the same thing. I constantly am losing track of, since we're on different time frames, that's a Monday, Wednesday, Friday class, I lose track of what I was doing in one class versus what I was doing in another class. I know I did the Mahele part. I did the adverse possession law. And I think that's where I came to a screeching halt. I did talk about adverse possession in this class, right?
Yes, yeah, you did.
Okay, good, good. And that's where I sort of ended, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good, thanks. Okay, now there's one of the paradoxes in Hawaii is that the missionaries that come over, the 1821 New England missionaries that come over, or if you would, the Congregationalist, Calvinist Congregationalists, I don't know, whatever word you want to use for them. When they come over here, you have to remember they're coming out of not only an American value system, but as we'll see, they're coming out of a Calvinist value system. In that, the idea that becoming wealthy is a major logic that they use. Becoming successful, being wealthy, is actually seen as a blessing of God and as something that God requires of you. And the other big theme, of course, is, as we'll see, is this idea of individualism. Everyone has to be successful and be wealthy. You can't inherit it. This is one of the huge things, because it's important to remember that in Europe, the Calvinists, Congregationalists, Puritans, whatever you want to call them, are a very, very small force outside of Switzerland. They never really impact what's going on. And this is one of the classic ways you see this in most of Europe. Most of your status and power and prestige is in inherited money, whether it be through nobility or successful families like the Krupps, the European industrialists, the Rothschilds. So having money that you inherited is actually considered better than money you made yourself. In fact, in Europe, this is called nouveau riche. It's called new money. So new money is looked down upon versus old money. Now, in the United States, because of the Calvinist logic, or at least in large part because of the Calvinists, what you get is the flip of that. In the United States, if you've inherited money, you go to a fair amount of effort to make it look like you didn't. And whether you're pro or anti-Trump, that's been sort of an interesting dance he's done, because his dad was very wealthy and he acquired a fair amount of that. But if you look at his autobiography and his other presentations, he goes to great lengths to point out that he made his own money. Now, that's not to say whether it's good or bad, but in an American context, that's how you have to do it. You don't get any creds here in the United States if you inherited money, because that's called sort of a silver spoon. In other words, you didn't do anything for it, you got lucky. In Europe, that's what you want. In the United States, it's a negative, or at least it's not a positive. On the other hand, the American stereotypes would be sort of the Bill Gates or someone like that. You know, you build something in the back of your garage and you end up being worth $1 gazillion, and that's the American way of doing it. Those folks are actually looked down on in Europe. So the American concept of what is good and right and how you're supposed to do stuff is radically different than the European. It's always something to remember, because Americans are so ethnocentric. We sort of assume that Europeans are like us. And to be honest, there's not a lot in common in a lot of ways. And that's one of the big ones. Now, where this comes to the crux is that the missionaries coming over here from New England are like the uber version of that, because they're actually Calvinist missionaries. So they're the walking, talking personification, trying to proselytize this value system along with their view of religion to the Hawaiians. And one of the ironies is when the missionaries come over here, of course, they're being paid for by church tithings. So their congregations back in, Massachusetts or Rhode Island or whatever are putting money in the hat or putting money in the pot or however the hell they do it. And that money's then used to basically pay the travel expenses and the living expenses for the guys that come over here as missionaries. So they're not coming over here on their own dime. They're coming over here on a bunch of people giving them money to bring the word of God and the New England value system to the heathens, and also to the bad Europeans living here in Hawaii. Now the irony is, of course, is within basically about 2 to 3 years, the vast majority of the missionaries quit their mission. They never pay the money back. And they go out and they start being entrepreneurs. And so one of the ironies is that the missionaries are, on one hand, a classic example of Calvinism in a sort of ultimate form, that people can actually donate money to you to do something, but you don't feel any particular compunction to do what you promised you were going to do. You may say, I've done it for 24 months, I'm out of here. Never mind the fact that you told folks that you were going to do this like 5 or 10 years. And the ironic thing is Bingham, who's the head of the missionaries, goes absolutely berserk about this. And he's constantly complaining, both to the ones here and also back in New England, that you've got to do a better job at picking these people, because they're coming over here basically to get a free ticket to Hawaii, and then they're gone. So the missionaries right from the get-go are not exactly a real sterling example of what are oftentimes sort of seen as sort of mainstream American, in fact mainstream Christian values. They're pretty radically different. Now, most of those missionaries then, understanding that they're under the control of the monarchy, so they're here and they're allowed by the chiefs. And Kamano does this constantly. She's constantly throwing the missionaries out. I think 3 different times she says, basically, I'm tired of listening to you guys. You guys are full of crap. I want you guys off the island in a day or two. She never actually follows through with it. But she's, in a very intentional way, she and some of the other high chiefs are making it very clear to the missionaries. The only reason you guys are here is because we're letting you stay here. We own the house. We're letting you stay in one of the rooms. But if we change our mind, then you get your butt out of here because you don't have any legitimate reason to be here other than what we say you do. Now, of course, this grates on the missionaries, but they're pretty realistic to understand that's the way it works. A lot of these missionary folks, especially when they get out of the missions, then are really sort of an equivocal situation. If they're not doing their missionary stuff, if they're not doing the education, if they're not doing religious training, then the chiefs can start asking, well, what the hell are you still doing here? We let you in to do X. You're not doing X anymore, but you're still living on our land. You're still asking us for food and stuff like that. What are we getting out of it? So what happened is many of these folks then, their strategy, and you have to remember these folks are highly individualistic. They're always going to look at it from what's in it for me. It's very much a me first approach. Now, this wasn't true of all the Europeans here. This is true of the Calvinist missionaries. Remember, this is 1822, 1824, 1825. So we're already 40, 50 years into the Euro-Hawaiian, sort of experience. What they do is they very quickly realize that the folks that are calling the shots are chiefs. And the one way to get out from the what are you still doing here context is to marry into the chiefly families. So an enormous proportion of these missionaries that come over here marry Hawaiian chiefs. And you have to remember, this is just to the start of that period when there's sort of this color thing starts to pop up in the Euro-American psyche. So it's not really a good thing to do, but they're not marrying Hawaiians. They're marrying Hawaiian royalty, and that's how they always phrase it. So they see themselves as marrying the upper tier, the quality, if you would, of Hawaiian society, and that legitimizes what they're doing. So in that context, that becomes the scenario. These folks, the kids that they have, then are obviously Hapa. They're half Hawaiian from the Ari'i on one hand, and they're from the New England missionaries on the other side. Now, it's not unique. I mean, there's also some of the other, especially Americans, that come over here as traders that also marry into Hawaiian families, etc. And some of the Brits do too. But the huge players in this very quickly become these missionaries because they're doing this in a very calculated way. They're not marrying into the chiefs in large part because they want to have a Hawaiian family or buy into the Hawaiian values or become part of the monarchy. They're doing it because they want to make a ton of money. And the only way they can do that is get within the control cycle. And the control cycle is the chiefs. Now, what happens is very early on then, because some of the missionaries are coming over as married families, but most of them are single men, is they actually set up a school for themselves. They set up 2 schools. The first school is Lahaina Luna, which is the first school west of the Mississippi, formal education school. And so that's set up for the chiefs. So that's set up to educate the chiefs in how to read and write. And with that, there's an attitude that the folks that go through Lahaina Luna will then take the Calvinist Congregationalist message and will be the next generation of sort of missionary preachers out into the Hawaiian countryside. So it's through Lahaina Luna that you get these documents translated, the Proverbs, the Bible. Andrew's first dictionary is originally printed at Lahaina Luna. So Lahaina Luna sort of becomes the intellectual center for, if you would, the Hawaiian part of the equation. Now the missionaries, and specifically these guys are marrying Hawaiian chiefs, they don't want their kids going to that school. They want their kids to be educated in the New England half of the family's way of doing stuff, either the Congregationalist view, and that becomes Oahu College, which is now Punahou. So Punahou is set up to educate the missionary children. Now remember, the missionary children, a large proportion of them are Hapa. Okay? The Hawaiian elite are educated at Lahaina Luna. Now, when the monarchy moves to Honolulu in the 1840s, then what happens, they set up the Chiefs Mission School, and the royal family and their closest entourage are educated at the Chiefs Mission School right downtown. But they're not educated at Punahou, Oahu College. So right from the get-go, there's this segregation between what you're teaching the Hawaiian chiefs and what you're teaching your kids from the missionary standpoint. When you graduate from Oahu College / Punahou, you're then generally sent back east to finish your education at one of the in New England institutions that your dad graduated from. Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, Princeton, whatever it might be. Because they were all, these folks were really highly educated. The vast majority of them were college educated. In the 1700s, 1800s, that's unheard of. No one even, most folks didn't even get to the third grade. So the missionaries that come over here have a very high opinion of themselves. And in the American educational system, they had a right to be, they're all beyond what you'd call a PhD in modern terms. So they set up the segregated educational system. The commoners and everyone else are just educated in the churches by largely Hawaiian lay priests who are teaching them how to read, write, and basically Calvinist values. The chiefs are taught at Oahu College / Punahou. The missionaries are taught at Chiefs Mission School and/or Lahaina Luna, and the missionary kids are taught at Punahou / New England. Now, what this means is the missionaries that come over here really don't do a huge amount of changes. The changes are their kids. And the key here is you have to visualize these kids are basically at 5, 6, 7 years of age. Many of them are boarded at Oahu College. So they stay there, they live there in dorms. So they go through that educational system. When they finish, I think it was 10th grade is what you ended up at the time. Then they're sent back to New England to live with their Hawai'i half of the family, the New England half of the family. And there they go to advanced New England education. So from the time they're about 5 or 6 years old to the time they graduate from university or whatever they're doing back in New England, what's constantly pounded into them is the New England Calvinist value system. If there's any discussion of the Hawaiian value system, it's often with the context of your mom's side of the family, but it's not seen as an equivalent. At the top is the feeding chain is this New England system, very much a sort of an exotic other is the Hawaiian system. It's when these kids come back, they are the big players here. They become the missionary boys. So the missionary boys aren't missionaries. The missionary boys are the sons of the ari'i / missionaries who have been educated in New England, but when they come back here, they are from Hawaii. They're generally, in most cases, half Hawaiian. They're through the ari'i, in many cases tied right to the royal family. So they're not foreigners. They're from here. However, they've been raised to a certain extent as if they were foreigners by the intent of their fathers. And in some cases, their moms too, who figured the New England way was the more powerful way. When these folks come back, they're the ones that change Hawaii. They come back, and in part, unfortunately for the chiefs, they're mentally looking at the folk and they see one of the, say the Baldwin family, and they're saying, well, you guys are part Hawaiian, so therefore, since we're both chiefs from the Hawaiian concept, then if I tell you to do something, you'll do it because you hold what's important to us, which is the Hawaiian part. And the Baldwin guy will be going, yeah, but the reality is what he's holding to is the Calvinist individualistic part. So what happened is the chiefs didn't realize how much change was happening in terms of loyalty, relationships, the power of individualism versus group, had basically, and they didn't see that. Because in their view, that wasn't happening because they were raised in a different system. And even when they were Western educated, it was in a different system. These guys that come back needed a term. And back in the 1960s, one of the sociologists at UH Hilo, I was trying to figure out how to describe these folks. And he finally decided to use the word kama'aina, which is sort of an interesting term that existed before, but at least in the 19th century, this is actually what you see these folks called in the newspapers. So it looks like that was actually how these folks were titled in the late monarchy period, was this kama'aina, and it was a very specific term. So the kama'aina had to have these prerogatives. They had to be part missionary background or part Euro-American background. They had to be largely educated in New England, so their value system is very much stereotypically sort of Massachusetts. You want to sort of pick on a group. On the other hand, they are invariably tied to the monarchy specifically and to the Hawaiian system by virtue of birth. So all these folks are hapa. They become the massive landowning families here in Hawaii. They're the ones that take enormous advantage out of the mehele. They're coming back in the 1840s, maybe early 1850s, when the mehele is either in place or else it's finishing. And they see this ability for very little money to grab enormous pieces of real estate that for one reason or another sort of fallen through the cracks in this mehele thing. And they're the ones that acquire this property. They're also the ones that absolutely just go berserk using this adverse possession law to basically suck up enormous amounts of real estate here in the Hawaiian Islands. So for example, on Molokai, this would be the Meyer family. The Campbell family, Doles, Wilcox's, Castle, Cook, Alexander Ball, the name goes on and on, but it's a relatively small group. And they all went to Punahou. They all were educated in New England, and they all came back home to Hawaii. Now, one of the stereotypes that you get that's very popular right now with a lot of folks is the idea the missionaries came in and stole Hawaii. The missionaries didn't. It's the kids of the missionaries, and the missionary kids were from here. They were local kids. Now, you have to remember at the time that they're going through this, you don't have, if you're local, you probably, your great-great-grandparents weren't here yet. The Chinese haven't arrived except for a few. Japanese haven't arrived. Filipinos haven't arrived. All the other groups ain't here yet. So these guys become sort of the first version of local, is this Haole Hawaiian amalgamation. And in this situation, given their value system, they become the players, and basically they own the Hawaiian Islands from the 1860s right down to the 1960s. So for 100 years, they hold sway and they're their power structure here. And so that's what's important to remember about them. They never were the government per se, except maybe a little bit during the Republic, but they always owned the majority of real estate. They were always the main generators of revenue. So by the 1860s, 1870s, when Kalakaua wants to, for example, make things happen and bring back Hawaiian values, he's fighting against these guys because one, they are part Hawaiian, and they can say, from their standpoint that they don't see any particular value in Hawaiian values, and what's more important is the New England values that they've been brought up in. So you're not arguing with strangers, you're not arguing with foreigners. You're arguing with folks, at least in part, share your own background, but just have an incredibly different idea how you do stuff. So in some ways, it looks a lot more like the dialogue you see happening in the United States today, where you got these sort of polar opposites in terms of how to do stuff, but they're all Americans. This is the important thing about the monarchy. The monarchy ends up in such a furball in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, just because the folks that are causing the trouble, in the sense of not liking the monarchy or not wanting Hawaiian stuff to be valid, are actually from the system. They're not outsiders. They're not people that suddenly showed up, and bought some Airbnb 6 months ago in Lanikai or something like that. So it's important to remember it was an internal thing. And so the vast majority of these folks are in the system, and by the 1860s and 70s, they're the players. Let me show you how this looks here. Oops, hang on a second. Okay, here's Palolo. Here's the sort of middle part of Palolo. This is 6th Avenue here, and this is what's now 11th Avenue here. This is Montserrat's 1881 Land Court Award. In other words, the Mahele Awards map for this part of Palolo. The large holdings, including Kapuhi, for example, all this was owned by Lunalilo. All your large holding here are held by chiefs. So they're the ones that did well out of the Mahele. Your little holdings, which in some cases here are really tiny, zoom in just a bit, are the ones held by commoners. Now, there's also huge chunks of property like this one here, this site over here, that aren't held by anyone. So after the Mahele was done in, say, 1852, when it's pretty much finished, what happens is these folks got their awards, but this is all they had. Now, they probably originally farmed maybe an area 4 or 5, 6 times larger, but the only part they could actually prove that they had access to or could control was these little tiny spots. 1853, 1854, the Kama'aina, the missionary kids, can now at auction buy up all the rest of the property in Palolo for pennies, basically acquire all the rest of this. And at that point, they can make life really hard for the Maka'aina farmers here, because these folks are trying to survive on a really small piece of real estate. And these folks will basically, I'm starting to see this in the newspapers, they put up no trespassing signs, for example, for the rest of the valley, which basically says you can't cross my land, you can't use my land, you can't access, my land. Which all of a sudden means if you're one of these guys, you might not be able to get access to your property because you'd have to trespass on someone else's land to get to your land. Now, what they also do is very quickly, you have the chiefs, like Kepuhi, for example. I think he passes away in, I can remember, we're just starting to look at this stuff. We'll just arbitrarily, he passes away in 1870. But in the 1860s, we'll say that particularly usual with the chiefs, he has a lot of land that he's given largely on Oahu. But he doesn't have a lot of money, but he has a nice house that he wants to build in Waititi, Waikiki. So he needs cash. So one of the missionary boys will come up to him and saying, hey, I've heard that you're, trying to get a loan from the bank and they won't do it. If you sell me the property in Palolo, I'll give you, $300 or something like that, which is, a good sum of money at the time. Kepuhi might not want to do that, but he needs the money more than he's that interested in the land. So and that land disappears. So all of a sudden you find that one owner might suddenly own a large proportion of the property in places, and Palolo is a very good example of that. You look at this, and if you actually think about that, the amount of land that's actually in private hands, the idea of Makanana hands, is really tiny compared to the whole area when you realize all this is wet field systems here. So all this land is equally productive. It's just the vast majority down here in what used to be called Kapuhulu was not claimed by anyone because they couldn't figure out a way to actually justify the claim, or it wasn't allowed by the land commission. So all this land falls up to auction, and I can guarantee someone bought it up in a snap. And it's one of these folks that has money and has resources, which are going to be the folks that are coming back from their period of time in New England. So this is it's a tiny example of how this process happened in Hawaii. And it happened in all the islands. And like I said, there's a ton of literature on this. If you want to jump ahead and actually figure out how this goes, we haven't gotten into this yet, but we'll get into it when we get into the sort of Hawai'i Chinese thing. The one that deals with the American religion, there's a PowerPoint on that. If you go back in the back part, here's the chart. And this is sort of the way I've tried to summarize the differences between a Hawaiian value system and a Calvinist value system. And so the Calvinist value system, as we'll see, is not only American, but the sort of stereotypic example of it is the Congregationalist Calvinist missionaries that come here. So the guys that come here starting in 1820, when the marry Hawaiian chiefs and become the Kama'aina boys, they're like the walking, talking stereotype of this set of values. And if you look at this set of values, and you can do this on your own time, I will go over it later. And when you look at that contrast the Hawaiian set of values, you very quickly realize the two head are basically a total non-fit. There's very little that they agree upon. And because this Calvinist Congregationalist approach was the ones that very quickly are getting control of the monarchy, they control the legal system, the financial system, foreign affairs, for example. So they very quickly control parts of the actual monarchy bureaucracy to make things happen. They're also the ones that control all the land. So that means they control the purse strings because they're the people who would be paying taxes. So the combination of all those factors means that pretty much by the 1870s, they don't have to actually take over the monarchy. They have taken over, they bought it. And their value system is totally here. And that becomes the history of Hawaiian change in the 19th, 20th century, is the increasing total dominance of a Calvinist value system, not a mainstream American system, a Calvinist system. Mainstream American values don't really show up in Hawaii in a major way until the territorial period in 1900, which is already, 50 years after these guys have been started laying down the law and setting up how things are going to work. So the monarchy persists till 1893. We then have a republic with these guys pretty much in charge till 1899. Then we become part of the United States. In that context, from the 1850s, 1860s, this becomes the system. Now you have to remember, if you're the Hawaiian chiefs and especially the monarchy itself, things are really complicated because these are the guys that you've invited in and you have made them the religious branch of the monarchy. The Congregationalists are the monarchy's church. And again, you look around town, and that's your big church cathedrals are them. So you're sort of in a weird situation. You've traded the kahunas, who didn't really do what you wanted to if you're the high chief. And you trade them for a group of Calvinists who don't do what you want as the high chief. And in the ultimate scene of things, the Calvinists were a lot worse deal because they have an entirely alien value system. And because their value system is entirely focused on individual gain, they can screw you into the ground and they have absolutely no compunctions about it because to them that's just clever business practice. So one thing Hawaiians didn't get in the 19th century, except for a few, Kalakaua was probably the most aware of this. Liliuokalani, I don't think ever really grasped it completely, was of how alien of a value system there was. And you really couldn't have a discussion with them about Hawaiian values as if they were going to actually apply them. Because at some point, if you said the group's more important than the individuals, that guy might go, yeah, but you can't trust them to actually do that. And when push comes to shove, they would always do what they wanted to as an individual and basically screw the group. So the monarchy falls in large part due to the value system that these folks pretty much start to lay down in Hawaii and use to basically take over Hawaii economically. Having said that, they then also generate some stereotypes of Hawaiians. But this is also why, if you've ever noticed, that you have this real weird situation that on one hand, you have the stereotype of the powerful Hawaiian. And again, the stereotypic example would be the Kamehameha statue downtown. So you have all this mythos about the founding ruler who makes the Hawaiian Islands a kingdom, a monarchy. Then you're followed by a group of kings who, you know, even the sort of Western-based literature is sort of ambivalent about in terms of what they did or didn't do. And, you know, some of them were actually really nice guys, but they would occasionally backslide and not do the right moral thing, i.e. the Calvinist thing. And then you end up with Kalakaua, who becomes the huge puzzle, you know, in terms of being on one hand a very sophisticated guy. On the other hand, at some point becomes pretty anti-Calvinist. So you sort of paint him with a mixed brush. And then basically the classic sort of, you know, Kamaina mantra is the monarchy fails because of its lack of morality. And so the Kamaina have to come in and sort of clean up shop. And that's the republic, and then / that's why it has to go to the United States. So all this is seen as sort of an inevitability, which is really convenient if you're one of these Calvinists, because it downplays the fact that you basically, you know, took advantage of a bunch of people by virtue of your value system. It's a lot easier to take advantage of a group if you see individualism be your key logic. It's really hard to take advantage of an individual if you see group as your key logic. So these guys, right from the get-go, were important. And one thing that really is sort of key would be, ironically, and I'm not an anti-Punahou, I have relatives going to Punahou, would be the fact that Punahou is the big player in all this. Oahu College, by educating the kids, and still, if you look at Oahu College, if you look at Punahou today, their educational curriculum is very New England. They're one of the highest ranked schools. They have one of the largest number of students going to elite New England universities in the United States. And that's because they do a really good job of sort of spinning the modern version of these values, which is their mantra. So sorry if you're a Punahou grad. Okay, yep. Get back to this. Okay. So what happens with the last, 35, 40 years of sort of the monarchy, republic period? Right off the bat, if you think of your image of Palolo, most Hawaiians now have very limited access to land, which means they have very limited access to resources or ways to make money. You need land to make money. You don't have access to land. You can work for someone else, but then you're going to get paid a real crappy wage and you're not going to have any money. You just have enough money, basically with survival wages. So you're basically given two choices. And this is at least how the Hawaiians saw it. For the vast majority of Makanana, you could do one of two things. You could either go, okay, this is the new game in town. The Kamaina run this place. They define how the rules are going to be. They define how it's going on. The monarchy is sort of doing whatever, but it's not really seen as a very functional entity. To be honest, it sort of looks like the state decision-making loop that's occurring with COVID right now. They might have the best of intents, but things just really don't seem to be very clear or very organized or very structured. That's how the monarchy appeared to many Hawaiians in the late 19th century. So in that situation, you figure, well, okay, I'm not stupid. I'm smart. I can see the writing on the wall. If I want to survive and I want my family to get ahead in the world, I'm going to have to assimilate into this Anglo-American system pushed by the Kamaina. So I'm going to move to an urban area. It might be Lahaina, it might be Hilo, it might be Honolulu. And what I'm going to do is I'm then going to, put my kids into regular schools. And by the early 20th century, I'm going to tell them, don't speak Hawaiian unless you have to. Learn English, because that's where the way to get ahead is. And that's because I've decided that love it or leave it. The reality is that Hawaii is turning into a place where the Anglo-American system rules. And if I want my kids to have a good house and everything else, that's the way I've got to play it. So that's option one. Option two is I basically say, screw this. I don't like this. I don't buy into this, Kamaina value system. I don't see it. It doesn't make any sense to me. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going as far away as possible. And so what you get is a movement of another group of Hawaiians that basically opt out of this assimilation process and move to as far away as they can get to basically, as much as possible, hold on to what they see as their own value system. And this is Mililii. This would be parts of Puna, lots of Ka'u, for example, parts of Kohala. On the Big Island, this would be East Maui in large part, and to a certain extent, the northeast part of Maui. pretty much the whole western half of Molokai. On Oahu, this would be the Waianae area. On Kauai, this would be to a certain extent the north side, Honolulu side, and certainly I would say Waimea side to the southwest. So these are the areas that people go to because they don't want to be a part of this assimilation process. And so what you get is, now remember, all these folks are Hawaiian. They're just making both very clear, very calculated judgments on what's important to them. And one group basically says, what we still hold of our traditional value system is important, so I've got to move away. The other group says, I respect and I'm a part of that system, but the realities in the world we live in, this is the new world, and so I'm going to embrace it. And this is the dichotomy you see with folks that identify themselves in Hawaii in the 21st century. They're the result of decision-making processes that occurred in the last 100, 150 years by family about what they were going to be, where they were going to go, where they were going to live, and how they were going to do it. But it pretty much split down into two schisms, which you still see today. What you also find then is if you think of the Kamehameha statue, so that, and again, this is a huge spin for the Kama'aina because, at some point, remember, these folks are coming across this on the moral high ground. They see themselves as being educated in a religious background, Calvinist, Puritan, Congregationalism. They're going to the New England universities, but you have to remember Harvard, Yale, Princeton, all these places originally were religious schools. They were seminaries. They trained missionaries. So they were just like BYUH is today. They were explicitly religious institutions. They were very moral, high tone. They had a very strong sense of who they were and their religious obligation. So when these guys are being trained at Punahou and then they're going to New England to get their final training, they're coming back with a really big chip on their shoulder about the moral superiority over everyone else, especially other Anglos, other Americans and Europeans. So, if you're some American who grew up in San Francisco and you went to a public school and something like that, and you find yourself in Hawaii, these guys are going to treat you like shit. Because as far as they're concerned, they went to church. They know how the Bible works. They know how it all works. They're very religious people. And they'll also screw you into the ground in a second because that's part of the way they view their religion. So in this context, they have sort of a dichotomy. They're taking advantage in many cases of their Hawaiian side of the family. A lot of the land they buy and a lot of the adverse possession is actually from their own relatives in the family, of their I'i'i side of the family that stayed in the Hawaiian context. But at the same time, they morally have to show that they're superior. But that's sort of hard if you have the concept of family, which of course is a big thing in Christian values also. So what you do is you then come up with a set of logics, justifications, that basically say that Hawaiians that are alive by the 1860s, 1880s, and after are basically sort of like not good quality knockoffs of their grandparents. So on one hand, you get a huge amount of stuff in the newspapers talking about how important and how powerful, how successful, how impressive Kamehameha I was. At the same time, this will be in the period of Kamehameha V or Kalakaua or something like that, and you immediately then contrast how good the Hawaiians were back then and how lousy they are now. How hardworking the Hawaiians were back in 1770 or 1800 and how lazy Hawaiians are in 1860. So what you do is you contrast dead Hawaiians to living Hawaiians. And in that context, you always make the living Hawaiians to be negative. They're always missing stuff. They're on Hawaiian time. They're goofing around all the time and they want to surf and party. They don't want to work hard. This list goes on and on and on. And this becomes the stereotypes. And the reason that if you're especially the Kama'aina, you generate those stereotypes, which is sort of weird because remember, part of you is Kama'aina, is Hawaiian, is that you want to justify taking over Hawaii from the Hawaiians, is that you argue that the living Hawaiians aren't suited to run their own country because they're not the same people they were back in 1800. So you blame it on them. And that very conveniently means that then you're entirely legitimizing that you keep control and you take control. And this becomes the whole republic. When Dole and those guys take over get rid of the monarchy, get rid of the Liukalani and take it over and make it a whole republic. They're arguing they have to do it from a moral standpoint, given the amount of embezzlement and corruption and stuff in the monarchy and the fact that she was going against the law. So they're constantly painting the royal family and the monarchy as a system that had its chance and it's failed. So you got to clean house and come up with a new morally superior form of doing stuff, which they sort of happen to say, oh, by the way, that's us. those negative stereotypes become the personification of what become the Hawaiian stereotypes in the 19th, 20th century. This is why you devalue hula. This is why you devalue Hawaiian language. This is why you devalue Hawaiian values in all ways, shapes, or form. Because if that's practiced by living Hawaiians, by definition, it's not as good as it would have been when Cook first saw them. And that's very convenient for the folks that are running the system because they're trying to argue that everyone should be New England Calvinist. So the only thing about Hawaiians is it's interesting as a historical context, but it's not of value as a social, moral, ethical, cultural context. If you ever want to read this, I'll give you the citation. Seiler's Lost Kingdom is a superb work that she did a couple of years ago, looking at the fact that the collapse of the monarchy is really between these two sort of value systems and the fact that they were mutually antithetical. They couldn't exist in the same place in the same time because they didn't see the other as being legit. And especially the Calvinist point was just, it had absolutely no tolerance for what it saw as a failed system of values, i.e. the Hawaiian value system. And so that's why we end. We end as a monarchy because of the increasing power and attitude of these missionary boys, not the missionaries per se, but their kids and their grandkids, who by that time own the Hawaiian Islands. Now, one of the sort of petty, they get some of theirs back is we'll see when we become a territory, they suddenly find themselves in a bad situation. This is one reason why when the Republic ends in 1898, 1899, a lot of the missionary boys were actually not all that happy about it. And the reason is they very quickly realized under the monarchy, they basically ran the system. They wrote the laws. They figured out how much they were going to pay in taxes. They were in charge. It was basically their country. It just had a monarch sort of around kissing babies and doing stuff. But they pretty much were running the system. When we become a territory, all of a sudden everything's run by Washington, D.C., 6,000 miles away. And all of a sudden they have no power. They have no control. Now even the governor is appointed by Congress. And they suddenly realize they put themselves, for their own sort of combination of attitude and avarice, they blew themselves up. They kept control of the place economically right into the 1960s, but they lose complete legal sort of political control of Hawaii the minute we become a territory. Because then we're just a small ancillary auxiliary piece of the United States mainland government. And we're very much treated as a little unimportant piece, the same way that the American government still treats Guam and American Samoa as little unimportant pieces. We were in that same context in the 20th century. And the missionary boys blew it. Sorry. Okay, so that's the system. Here we see the demographic changes. One of the interesting things to remember this is you have to remember when you're measuring the drop in number of Hawaiians. This isn't necessarily, we're not measuring blood quantums here. This isn't done through blood test. This is people identifying themselves as Hawaiian. So what you notice is the number of people that identify as Hawaiian drops enormously between 1890 and 1920. The number of people that identify themselves as part Hawaiian is also never doesn't increase. Now the reality is the number of people who are part Hawaiian was increasing, but that's not how people wanted to be seen. So what you get is the way that the population gets seen here is this gives you an idea of how being Hawaiian didn't have a positive connotation by the late monarchy, early territorial period. So people are trying to not identify with it or they're just keeping their mouth shut. And this becomes critical because that segues into our next one here, which we'll finish off with. Okay, now by the 1860s, 1870s, as this Kama'aina value system, the Calvinist value system starts to come into play and more becomes the key value system here. It's important to remember then what happens is Hawaiian moves from culture to ethnicity, and we went through that thing at the very beginning of the semester. What starts to happen is being Hawaiian becomes rather than the normative system that the population here lives under, especially by the 1880s, 1890s, where the Hawaiians are actually a minority population due to Asian immigration for the plantations. At that point, then what being Hawaiian turns into is ethnicity. It turns into a combination of who you self-identify as and the group that accepts you as a member. Okay. Now, that's not better or worse than culture, but it is different. And it's one of the confusions you get into today is, again, the misuse of the word culture in Hawaii, especially in the 21st century. Hawaiians, being Hawaiian ethnically is not any less than being Hawaiian culturally, but it is a different thing because it's a different set of criteria attached to it. It can be more rigid than culture would be. It can be less, but it is different. And not surprising if you think about it, in the early part of the 20th century, if you look at those stats, being Hawaiian, since it involved group identification, someone saying, I'm Hawaiian and you're Hawaiian, and then also saying, yeah, I'm Hawaiian. That becomes something that people become very quiet about, especially in the urban areas like Honolulu by the 1910, 1920 period, when being Hawaiian doesn't have a positive value attached to it, and these negative stereotypes are getting very strong. So what you find is even though people actually have that heritage, they might have the values, they might have the beliefs, they might still speak the language at home, they're in many cases going out of their way to not self-identify as that, because there's no positive reason to do so. It's like banging your head against a wall. You're not going to get anything out of it, and it's going to really hurt. And in many cases, it's going to put your family in a worse situation. So why would you do it if you're going to hurt the chances of your kids, for example? So in looking at ethnicity versus culture, here's again to reiterate, there's the 2 points. Okay. Now, when you look at this, and this becomes a huge, if you analyze, for example, the Monarchy discussion going on, which sort of petered out right now because of COVID, or calmed down, I guess. You can see this whole ethnicity thing playing out, because what you got is the folks that were Hawaiians that were pro-observatory, especially Polynesian Voyaging Society, and there are folks that identified as Hawaiian who were very anti-observatory. And one of the things you'd see if you looked at social media discussions, especially on Twitter, was, well, you can't be a real Hawaiian if, you can just fill in the blank. That's an ethnicity discussion. You can't have that argument if you're doing culture. Culture is a collective thing. Ethnicity it can be a pretty selective thing, because you can then have a subgroup basically say, we're the only true Hawaiians, for example, and we define group acceptance and validation by virtue of X. So for example, and there's at least one sovereignty group over on Maui and the Big Island that says you can't identify yourself as Hawaiian unless you speak the language at home. Okay. And that's their definition of being Hawaiian. That's a very ethnic definition. Other groups would just say, well, if you have certain parts of values and you have the genealogy or whatever, then you identify as Hawaiian. Okay, that's another group. Now, neither of those groups is wrong. They're just different. Okay, they're both ethnically Hawaiian. That doesn't mean that they're mutually agreeing in terms of what that is, but you just have to accept that that is what it is. There's not an easy category. And one of the problems you get into, especially in the 21st century, is the fact that the media tries to spin everything into very easy, tidy categories of you're either this or you're that. And of course, every time they try to get in this whole discussion of Hawaiian, they just totally jam up because they try to make something really simple out of something that's incredibly complicated. And if you think about it, you can see this classically, because on one hand, oftentimes the media will sort of get on the sort of, sort of the rolling the eyes, think, well, here we've got a bunch of Hawaiians who can't agree on who they are. Well, if you think about it, if you look at the national discussion right now, there's a hell of a lot of discussion about who's actually American and who isn't. And no one disses on Americans, within the American system for having that disagreement. But one of the negative Hawaiian stereotypes that persist in the 21st century is somehow Hawaiians are supposed to have total agreement on what that is. When I was growing up, I used to see this in the reservation. One of the classic ways that the American government and Anglo-American society would look at Indians, oh man, look at those Cheyenne and Arapaho. Those guys can't agree on everything. They're arguing about even who they are. And then everyone's just like rolling the eyes. Never mind the fact that the Anglos were equally good about arguing about who they were, but somehow that was different because they didn't have the negative stereotype to attach itself. So that's the first thing about ethnicity. Ethnicity isn't worse. Ethnicity is just what it is. But what it does mean is you can't assume when you're talking about ethnicity that there's a coherent set of values and beliefs that permeate the entire system. Okay. When you look at what you find when people identify as being Hawaiian and Hawaiian values in the 20th, 21st century, you do find a set of these. Now, from individual to family to group, these vary in terms of how much they have or how much they're embedded into the family. But you generally will find these. And these are all part of what was Hawaiian culture at the time of European contact. One is the extended family. Oftentimes the word used now is ohana, which still makes my teeth great. But nonetheless, the idea of the extended family. And you classically see this through the second, which is one of the classic stereotypes that classic things you see here But I don't think people actually think about it. And in many ways, this has actually also become part of the local system because, for example, Chinese have a very similar value like this. And this is the fact that what are very explicitly mother-father roles in an Anglo-American society. In Anglo-American society, aunties and uncles are nothing like your mother and your father. Your mother and father have legal rights over you. They have all sorts of moral control. They're going to be blamed if something goes wrong. If you're a kid, your parents are the thing. In even modern Hawaiian ethnic values, which you frequently find is folks that would be called auntie and uncle are actually seen as parts of mother and father. If you're in a Hawaiian family that's fairly traditional, and the folks are calling you uncle or they're calling you auntie, that actually means that in a traditional family, that means that you have the responsibility and control of what we would in the Anglo-American system call nieces and nephews. You can punish them. You're responsible for their behavior and everything. You can't blame it on their biological parents. So in the Hawaiian value system, nuclear family is a not-goer. It's not that people don't understand who their biological parents are. And in some cases, they're closer. But they might also be closer to other members of the family in the same generation, aunties and uncles. And it's very common to find that folks have a very close affinity to a particular auntie and uncle who in many cases really becomes the surrogate parent. That's entirely logical, not only within Hawaiian society, but also within Polynesian society. Same thing traditionally in Samoa, et cetera, and other societies in Polynesia. So this idea of horizontal father-mother roles is a really, really was a big part of traditional Hawaiian culture, and is also and oftentimes a very strongly held thing within contemporary Hawaiian identity. Now you frequently see this in local society. On Oahu, I'm not a pro Oahu person, so on Oahu, if someone says, "Oh, here's uncle," whatever, I sort of think that means they're basically telling their kid, "Here's someone I know." If I go back to East Maui and someone, I'm down at Pukalani at the food end over there, and someone says, "Oh, uncle," that probably means it's a relative, and I have responsibilities to that person. So if they need a ride home, if they need something, then I got to give it to them because I'm basically part of the family to the extent that I'm almost like a parent, which is probably one reason why I don't go back to Maui a lot. So since I'm not very good at that. So father-mother roles apply to a much larger group of people. It's a much larger nurturing network, and it's a very responsibility-driven network. So depending on where you're from, especially if you're from the Outer Islands, you might be aware of the fact that where you grew up with, given your background, might be that auntie and uncle actually has a social category. It's not just sort of a label, which I think to me is one of the ways sort of differentiates Oahu from the other islands. The focus on family versus the individual. My background is partially Hanai. So Hanai is something that a lot of Hawaiian families still do. And Hanai in the traditional Hawaiian system that you still see with both groups is not something an individual does. Some lady doesn't come and suddenly grab your ass and say, "Oh, I'm Hanai and you as my nephew or my niece." That has to be a family discussion. The collective decides so-and-so would be a good addition to the family. They have the right set of attitudes, they get along with our family, they're very responsible, whatever it is that they have to offer, we like it. And so basically when you get Hanai in the traditional system, they do it to you. You're not asked for your input. It's just all of a sudden someone says, "Oh, now your uncle or now your brother or whatever," and you sort of realize, and someone will finally point out to you that you're now part of a system. That's Hanai. And the key here is the fact that family is more important than the individual. Individuals do not have relevance in a Hawaiian value system except as a part of a group, a collective. And that's what Hanai reflects. The rest of these we've already started gone through. Spoken word, still hugely important. It's probably one reason why Hawaiians are successful in things like entertainment, because they come from a system where what you say, how you say it, and how you present how you say it is really important. So it's not surprising that would make you a success in things like singing or something like that. Also in politics, traditionally Hawaiians were very good. Patterns of conflict avoidance. Again, you see this a lot with Hawaiian groups, and I see this especially back in Kanaio, back in East Maui. People go to great lengths to avoid face-to-face conflict. So again, if you're at the food land in Pukalani and upcountry Maui, and there's a bunch of the families in there from Kanaio or one of the families, they'll complain to me about what another family's doing, but if the other family's there, they'll shut up. They'll wait till the family leaves, then they'll complain about them. And so what they'll do is gossip is how you control relationships. You don't confront people. You don't get in someone's face and start yelling at them. You know, why'd you do this? This is wrong. What you do is you complain to your friends and relatives, especially relatives, and you actually then expect them to go and tell someone else, and eventually it goes around and gets to the person that you're upset with. Now, of course, the reality, thinking go back grade school, the old whisper game, is by the time it gets to that person, it's probably totally exaggerated and distorted from what they originally did. And this is one reason why conflict in Hawaiian families can look like a nuclear weapon going off, because it can get totally escalated out of proportion. I haven't seen any sort of studies about how social media impacts this. I think if anything, it actually minimizes a little bit because people tend to forward the message versus heavily modifying it. But they'll usually back it or say something about it. But in fact, my nickname when I go back to Kanaio, since I'm not part of the families there, is I'm the postman. So people expect me. In fact, I got a letter from one of the ladies a couple of months ago. When am I going to be back? And I'm pretty sure that that's because they want to bend my ear about one of the other families and know that as I wander around and see how everyone's doing in the community, I'm going to sort of be the gossip carrier. And that allows things to get done in a more equitable manner than them, gossiping to the third cousin or, auntie or something in Pukalani, and then it gets back all the way back to Kanaio. So this idea of visible conflict avoidance, you have the same amount of conflict, but you do it through gossip and sort of, networking, which is one, if you're familiar with Asian societies, this is how they work. This is Korean, Japanese, Chinese society, they work exactly the same. Lack of interest in visible status. Hawaiian society, Hawaiian culture, and Hawaiian values are very heavily based on social networks. Someone like Abe Pianai, who I knew pretty well, he was powerful as a Hawaiian in the 20th century here because he knew everybody, and everyone knew if they asked Abe can tell him, oh, contact so-and-so, or I'll call so-and-so for you. So he was like a fixer. He was like a spider in the center of a web of social relationships and obligations. That's power in the Hawaiian system. Power in the Hawaiian system is being a person who gets things done for folks, who can do favors, who has contacts, who has a phone that has a ton of people on it. And every time they call, they know whoever they call up will immediately call them back and, hey, I saw you called. What do you need? That's power. It's not the size of your house. It's not the size of your car. It's not how much money you make. You could have a bigger house, a better car, more money. But what you do is you fold that into that social network. So in the Hawaiian value system, social networking and the type of social relationships you have is the definition of status and prestige, which is the antithesis to the Kama'aina value system that they brought, which is manifestations of success, a house in Kahala or Black Point or Portlock, 2 Rolls Royces, a set of Gucci bags and a $5,000 or $10,000 Rolex watch, all that type of stuff. In a Hawaiian value system, people are sort of like wondering, well, if you spend it on yourself, what'd you do for your family? And so what it does is it devalues this idea of the value of the individual. And that's, if you go back to like Maui High or someplace, you can still see people picking fights. It's been about 8 years since I've been back to there. But if you go to Maui High School, one of the other schools, you see Hawaiians going after each other as kids. One of the ways you can do that is you say you're being selfish. And that's might not be the fastest way to start a fight, but it's a really, really, really fast way to do it. Because being individualistic is translated as being selfish. And being selfish is the antithesis of being part of a group. You can't do it if you're part of a Hawaiian value system. It's just not happening. So the last of these panels is just sort of a list of the complex relationships that folks that identify themselves as Hawaiians have had in the 20th century and since the 20th into the 21st with the larger sort of Kama'aina-based system, whether it be the territory, then the state of Hawaii, the federal government, various institutions are set up that theoretically are supposed to help Hawaiians, and I use that in quotes, Office of Hawaiian Affairs, Hawaiian Homes. It's a furball. For whatever it's worth, you see the same thing as you grow up on a reservation, except that they're Bureau of Indian Affairs, and they're equally dysfunctional. It's equally screwed up, and no one knows what the hell's going on. It's just the reality of dealing with systems that don't really understand who or what you are, and really have a very limited interest. Now, the only huge difference that you see between being Native American in most spots, so this actually in the Southwest would be like here, but for example, if you're from the Wind River Reservation where I have family, and you're Cheyenne Arapaho up there, you get a few tourists up there that want to see real Indians. But in large part, that reservation could be sucked up by aliens and no one would probably notice for 6 months. Here in Hawaii, what you have is in large part tied to the tourism sector, but also going back to that weird set of European views of Hawaiians, is that you end up with the tourism industry starting by the mid-late 19th century, encouraged by the Kama'aina, who then becomes absolutely dominant. Of course, you see that right now. But the weird thing about the tourism industry is the tourism industry here is it's tourism about Hawaiians. It's not tourism industry of place. It's tourism industry about a stereotype of Hawaiianness. So the tourism industry here depends about 89, 95% on Hawaiian in terms of their stereotypes of Hawaiian to market themselves competitively with other places like Cozumel, San Diego, Florida, other places with the same climate. They are more successful because of the way that they spun the idea of being Hawaiian, and that's unique to this place. This is a classic Live Aloha bumpers that you used to see like 5 or 10 years ago. I think the Hawaii Tourism Authority was laying out, or the campaign. When tourism starts up again, I can guarantee there's going to be a huge campaign about love the tourist and show aloha and be gracious and friendly to tourists, because that's what makes Hawaii special. And if that sounds familiar, it's because I've lived here for way too many years. I've seen like 5 or 6 different of these cycles. So, you know, you're going to get that again. No one says live local. No one says that local is good and tourists want to see local, because tourists wouldn't understand local if it smacked them upside the head. What they understand is there's stereotypes of Hawaiian, there's stereotypes of aloha. And that's what they want, and that's what they come here for. So the weird thing is by far the largest industry in Hawaii is involved in manipulating Hawaiian images and Hawaiian attitudes for its own purely monetary purposes. Having said that, then you get this weird dichotomy where on one hand, government and everything would really be happy if Hawaiian just disappears. It would make the legal system here a lot happier. On the other hand, the tourism sector desperately, totally, 200% needs Hawaiian. And this weird dichotomy is central to a lot of the strange discussions we have here, and a lot of strange stuff you see. And again, I'll leave you with this sort of thought. Think of the 3 statues. There's the Kamehameha statue at the front of the Judiciary in King Street. You go down King Street and you see the statue of Kamehameha III, that beautiful statue on the Mauka side on Thomas Square, which just went up this last year. Absolutely superb. And really sort of saying something about the monarchy in a bunch of really interesting ways. And then you go down to Waikiki and Kalakaua, and what do you find? You find the Duke Kahanamoku statue, which is what I would call the tourism Hawaiian statue. I mean, on one hand, he's a very interesting guy. But the fact that that becomes the stereotype of Hawaiians in the 20th, 21st century is really sort of telling when you compare that to the statue of Kamehameha from, what, 150, 200 years earlier. Okay, so with that sort of comes to a halt. Like I said, I'll be trying to get the short videos done for the project so you guys can get started on it. Now you've got the folder, so at least in some cases you've got your materials that you can start work on. In other cases, you're gonna have to do some real ferreting out and digging it. So sort of be warned, that's gonna vary, but I'll actually talk about that specifics in terms of specific jobs for specific people, and I'll try to get those done. I'll try to get them today done by this afternoon. If I don't, I'll get them done by tomorrow morning. So any questions or comments or what's it?